I'm going to install my flywheel again, making sure that the mark on the balancer and the flywheel line up right there. So to torque this flywheel to its 94 foot-pounds, this time I stuck a rag in between these gears and pried down on that, and then I can just back that rag off without loosening the bolt any, and I'm good to go. Okay, the next thing I'm going to install is my primary gear. So I have a new woodruff key. I'm going to slide in my shaft. And put my primary gear on. Okay, so using the same rag in the gears on the other side technique, and torque this up to 87 foot-pounds. Okay, so I'm going to do the pickup gap mod on my stator cover or flywheel cover before I put it back on. So to do that, I'm going to pull off my pickups, file off a little bit of material, put them back on so I can set the gap a little bit closer to the flywheel. Okay, so to give you an idea what this coil pickup mod is, I just took a file and I made a groove in the front of this plate, and I just kind of oblonged the holes out with a rat tail file so that when that sits in its home, these little stops, it can slide a little bit in further than where those stops allow, and then by oblonging those holes, my bolts can still fit in there and this can be closer. Okay, I'm going to replace this oil seal for my shift shaft and alternator cover. So I'm just going to pry this old one out of here. And I'll drive my new oil seal in using a 15mm socket. Perfect. You'll want to make sure you put your washer against your circlip on your shift shaft before you put the alternator cover on. Just going to put a little silicone around my rubber grommets on my alternator cover to make sure oil doesn't leak from there. Okay, I'm going to install my alternator cover now. I got my gasket sitting on here. The knock pins are in place. I put a little bit of lube on the oil seal for the shift shaft, and I think this is ready to go on. Perfect. Now I have my template for my bolts, so I can just start going around and putting those guys in place. I'll torque all these up to 69 inch-pounds, except for this guy. It'll get put in when the oil lines go in. Okay, so I'm going to try and set the gap on my coil pickups. I rotated the flywheel so the little plate that spins around is in line with the coil. I'm gonna set my gap to 0.02 inches. So I'm just gonna stick a feeler gauge in there, push this against the feeler gauge, and then tighten down these screws. I'm gonna put a little Loctite on those when I do that. And it's a good idea to use a brass feeler gauge. I don't have one, so I'm just gonna use a metal one and see how that works. So I got that pressed up against the feeler gauge. Tighten these pickups into place. Slide that feeler gauge out of there. And double check tightness. Do the same thing for this bottom one now. The next thing I'm going to do is place my oil lines, external oil lines. So it sits in there kind of like that. I'll need to remove the bolt on this adjuster here, chain adjuster. And I got new brass washers for all the connections, the banjo bolts. And then I'll put this guy in with some sealant down here, and we should be good to go. Okay, so I got my two banjo bolts started with their new brass washers in place. I got the little bolt over here. I got my cap nut back on, my tensioner, and I got this oil line bolt in there with some Loctite. So I'll torque these guys down to 104 inch-pounds. Now at the bottom of this oil line, I'll install my oil pressure valve, or sorry, my oil pressure switch, and it'll get a couple new brass washers as well. Will get torqued to 14.5 foot-pounds. There we go. Okay, now that I have this alternator cover on here, I can kind of route these wires underneath this little clamp here and tighten that down. And torque that guy up.